Hello, friends and neighbors. How are you all doing today? I just want to talk a little bit about Matthew chapter 24. I didn't cover it a lot whenever I did the Revelation series, but I was going through some of my Bible study notes and I ran across a printout that I did of the scriptures of Matthew 24 and some notes on them. And it reminded me when I last looked at it, I just had an epiphany. It's just all of a sudden, it was just Matthew 24 was just so plain, it just fell into place. And this chapter is a little controversial because people who believe that there is no rapture believe that Matthew 24 supports that. They believe that Matthew 24 is just telling step by step what is happening, and there is no mention of a rapture. And many people believe that Matthew 24 is consecutive. It just goes as a step by step list of what's going to happen, and there's no rapture in the list, so they think that Matthew 24 supports a post trib, that the rapture is after the tribulation, which makes no sense. But anyway, I just want to show you some divisions that I saw in Matthew 24, and I want you to go back and open your Bible and look at it and see if you can see those divisions. So, I probably should have got my notes a little neater. Let me see if this is it right here. So basically, Jesus tells the disciples that the temple is going to be destroyed. And they're asking him, when is this going to happen and what will be the signs? And so he proceeds to give them some information. And if you will look, I'm not going to go into verse by verse, but I'm going to tell you what I see as the divisions that just popped out on the page to me. So in beginning with verse 3 and going through verse 14, I believe this is just a general summary of the last days, of how it will be up until the end. Because as you read along, when Jesus is describing verse by verse what's going to happen, if you'll notice, they also kind of match up with the first 6 seals in Revelation. And so I have even, let me see if I can hold this up where you can see it. I have even the verse, and I put the verse, seal 1, description, the verse, seal 2, seal 3. So it almost matches up word for word with talking about the seals. So verses 3 through 14, I believe, are a general summary of the last days. And that's because in verse 13 it says, but the one who endures to the end, it's speaking of the end. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So whatever he's describing, there is an end. And if you'll look back in verse 6, he says, see that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. So he's describing a process. It is just a general summary of what the last days will be like. Verse 14 is the last verse of that short summary. So then if you'll go to beginning with verse 15, now all of a sudden he is focusing on an event that is huge and I believe is a trigger event. And that is verse 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, then that is the temple, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So he's saying, whoever's in Jerusalem, get out of there. So then he goes on and describes it some more. And all the way to verse 31. I believe that verses 15 through verse 31 is giving more detail about the last days from the point of the trigger event to the end. So once again, it's not consecutive. We don't have 3 or 4 different ends. He's talking about some details. He gave us the general summary in verses 3 through 14. And now he goes back and gives more details, beginning with a huge trigger event, the abomination of desolation. So get out your Bible and look through verses 15 through 31, and you will see that he's giving more details, but he's beginning from a very, very important event. So then, beginning with verses 32 through 50, I believe he's answering the other question. He's been answering the question of the signs. What's a description? What will it look like? He's answering the question of what will the signs be. Now he's answering the question of when. And he says, from the fig tree, learn this lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that the summer is near. And so many people believe, my hair's still wet, many people believe this is a reference to Israel, that when Israel becomes a nation again. And it would be interesting to look at verse 32 in several different translations. But people believe that Israel has always been symbolized by a fig tree, and that this is an indication that when you see things happening in Israel, when Israel becomes a nation again, you know that the time is near. It says, so also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So he's saying, when we see these things happen in Israel, and remember in 1947, something like that, is when Israel became a nation again. And I believe that is what he's referring to. When this happens, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So that is what many Bible scholars believe. And it probably would be good to do another video just on that, how Israel is a sign and an indication of what is happening in the last days. But I'm not going to take time to do that now. So verses 32 through 50, he's answering the when question. When will this happen? And then he gives a warning to be ready. And he talks about as just like it was in the days of Noah, that's how it's going to be when the Son of Man returns. Then he goes on, he tells the story about another parable, and starting with verse 45, another indication of a sign of when he will be returning, what it will look like. Then in chapter 25, he gives a lot more details. He talks about the 10 virgins and being ready. So he's answering the question of when it will be, some indications of when we might know that it's happening, and then he's giving warnings to be ready. So let me go over that again real quick. And just open up Matthew 24 and look at this if you have ever had any questions about it. I believe in verses 3 through 14. And remember, Jesus is answering a couple of questions for the disciples about when the end will be and when he will come. And I believe verses 3 through 14 is a general summary framework of the last days. And then I believe in verses 15 through 31, he's giving extra detail, beginning with a major trigger event, the abomination of desolation, when the Antichrist sets himself up in the temple of God, which lets us know there will be a third temple in Jerusalem. And he's talking about extra details from that trigger point also to the end. And then in verses 32 through 50, he's answering the question of when will this happen? And he's giving warnings to be ready. And it also carries over into chapter 25. So some of you may have already figured this out, but there's been so much confusion over the timeline and how things will happen in the last days. And everybody thinks their idea is right. And I have come to the place where I don't really know exactly how it's going to happen. I don't believe the Bible gives us enough details. And so I've had to be really honest with myself and say, a lot of the details are just not there. And so I have some opinions of what I think is going to happen, but I can't be 100% sure, and neither can anyone else on their opinions, because there's not enough information in the Bible. And I believe that that's for a reason. I believe that as we get closer, God will reveal more things to us. But I believe that Matthew 24 is not an indication that there will not be a rapture. I don't even think the rapture is the topic of discussion in Matthew 24. The topic of discussion is the destruction of Jerusalem. And as far as Israel is concerned, when is the Messiah coming back after them? They are all, these are all Jewish people who believed in the Messiah and believe that he has come. And I believe it's really looking at the whole thing, probably from Israel's perspective. So anyway, I don't believe the topic is the rapture at all. I believe the topic is answering the disciples' questions. When are the last days, and what will be the signs? And so I think it's as simple as that. We just kind of make it a little more complicated. So compare what I've talked about to Matthew 24 and see if it makes a little sense. That's all. I love you guys. Thank you for watching. I'm not quite finished. I do want to add one more thing. I had said that I didn't really believe that this passage, this chapter, was about the rapture. But there are some verses that people interpret as rapture language, and that is at the end of the chapter. We're looking at verse 37, starting at verse 37. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So this is speaking of destruction. When it says swept them all away, it's not talking about Noah saving, or God saving Noah and his family. It's speaking of destruction of the earth and destruction of those who did not believe Noah. So then when we look at the following verse, in verse 40, then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. So some people believe that that speaks of the rapture, and it is possible, But since they're speaking of destruction and the flood sweeping away all of the unbelievers, I believe that that is what it's continuing to speak about. The two men will be in the field. One will be taken and one left. So I believe it's speaking that some will be saved, some will be destroyed. So, but that's just my opinion. It could be speaking of the rapture, but it could also just be speaking of destruction, that some will be destroyed and some will not be destroyed. So looking at the context of the verses in front of that, I tend to think that it's speaking of some will be destroyed and some will not be. So that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think. Love you. I'm really finishing this time. Bye.